Okay, now I'm recording. So whether you are joining us from a public library or an academic institution, thank you all for being here and taking time to share your expertise, your questions, and your curiosity. One of the things that make this forum special is that it brings together professionals from across Louisiana and beyond, representing different types of libraries and institutions, all of us united by a shared commitment to access, learning, and service. The presentations over the next few days will remind us that innovation does not happen in a vacuum. Rather, it happens when we learn from each other and discover new approaches. Oh, sorry, distracted by the chat. Rather, it happens when we learn from each other and discover new approaches that we can take back to our own communities. This year, we'll hear presentations on accessibility, inclusivity, community engagement, opportunities, and challenges of artificial intelligence, archival storytelling, and so much more. Finally, I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to our presenters for generously sharing their work with us. I'd also like to thank our hosts and our chat monitors for keeping everything running smoothly this week, fingers crossed, and to our executive board whose work has made this forum possible this year. Recordings of each day will be made available by Friday, July 31st. We have also asked our presenters to share their slides and any supporting materials that they may reference during their presentation. These will be posted right under the session's title and the presenter's name. It'll also be listed under which day that presentation happened. Welcome, and let's begin with our first presenter, Dr. Megan Lowe of Northwestern State University of Louisiana, using copyright and fair use to support accessibility.
Thank you. Let me share my presentation. And I always have to do this. I want to flip it. There we go. Welcome. Good morning. This is using copyright and fair use to support accessibility. My name is Dr. Megan Lowe. I am the Director of University Libraries at Northwestern State University of Louisiana. My home base is Watson Memorial Library at NSU's main campus in Natchitoches, Forcum Demons. This work is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 2.0 international license. I like to provide an agenda or a signpost for my presentation. That way people know what to expect. I hope it helps people anticipate critical topics and points and prepare potential questions. I will start with a broad overview of copyright and then a broad overview of fair use. And I do mean broad overviews. Also, remember, I am a librarian and not a lawyer. After those overviews, I'll briefly discuss what compliance with copyright and fair use may look like. Spoiler alert, you probably already know how to be compliant. Then I will discuss what copyright and fair use have to do with access for education and then access for accessibility. Spoiler alert, they're related. Finally, there will be time for questions and answers at the end. So what is copyright? Copyright is a form of protection provided by the laws of the United States, Title 17 of the U.S. Code, to the authors of original works of authorship, including literary, dramatic, artistic, musical, and certain other intellectual works. This protection is available to both published and unpublished works. Note that the law says that a work does not have to be published to be copyrighted, but more on that shortly. Certain other intellectual works is usually understood as a way of the law attempting to keep up with technology and new forms of content and media. It's also important to understand that being out of print, or OOP, does not affect a work's copyright status. A work can be copyrighted and out of print at the same time, which is fairly common. Being out of print is not the same thing as being in the public domain. The definition that I provided on the previous slide was broad. There are a few key things not included in that definition that are important to know. Copyright is a bundle of rights intended to protect the author or the copyright holder. These are not always the same individual or entity. Copyright has commercial implications. This is a key element to this discussion. And these rights can be signed away and frequently are, which is how many publishers acquire the rights to works and authors lose control of their works. Books, articles, creative works, images, the original creators of any of these can surrender their copyright in exchange for compensation. Now, remember earlier when I said that a work does not have to be published to be copyrighted? That's because there is a certain degree of copyright that is automatically conveyed on a work created in the United States. However, if you want to ensure full and legal protection under copyright, you must apply officially for copyright. There's a form and a fee to pay. Remember how I also said that copyright has commercial implications? In most settings, particularly commercial ones, to use a copyrighted work, formal documented permissions must be obtained from the copyright holders. This could be the author themselves, their publisher, their estate, or some other legal entity. In some cases, it might require the payment of fees. Think of the licensing fee musicians may have to pay to use another musician's work. This could range from $50 to hundreds of thousands of dollars. So what's fair use? Fair use is a statute under copyright law that allows for the use of limited portions of a work that has copyright without having to have official permissions from the official copyright holder, and probably without paying for licensing fees depending on the medium. It was created for the purposes of education and research, that is, teaching, learning, and scholarship. There are other applications for fair use, but these are the ones that are really the most relevant to us in higher education and libraries. However, fair use is a little harder to pin down than copyright. After all, what qualifies as a limited portion of a work? The Copyright Office isn't very helpful on defining what a limited portion is. It only states that there is no specific number of words, lines, or notes that may safely be taken without permission. When using someone else's work, it's best to always give credit where credit's due, that is, attribution and documentation, if you're only using a small part. If you're unsure about the work in question, asking for permission is better. It's worth noting that APA format has its own ideas about what a limited portion is and recommends that 500 words or less is safely within fair use. Beyond that, permission should be obtained, but APA does not necessarily address other formats such as images or music and how much would qualify as fair use or abuse of fair use, that is copyright infringement. When in doubt, ensure proper attribution and documentation. That goes a long way in good faith in the context of fair use. So let's look at these concepts side by side to understand how they fit together. Copyright is a bundle of rights. All rights are reserved. It's primarily for protecting commercial interests. Copyright means that one's use of an original work may require explicit formal permission to be acquired. This may involve fees. Copyright can be transferred. A copyright holder may not be the original creator. Fair use is a statute under copyright law. The bundle of rights that represent copyright still applies. All rights are still reserved. Fair use is meant to foster education and research. That's why we can teach and do research and not have to necessarily obtain permissions for what we do, though depending on the discipline and context, we may have to pay licensing fees. Attribution and documentation of the copyrighted work are critical. Fair use disclaimers can be employed to acknowledge teaching and learning context. More on the disclaimers shortly. So how do I stay compliant with each? Let's spend a moment on compliance because that is important. With copyright, if you use someone else's work, you have to get permission to use that work. This may involve paying licensing fees. It may also be as simple as obtaining formal explicit permissions from the copyright holder. Attribution and documentation are critical. They may not look like the usual formats with which those of us in education are familiar, APA, MLA, Chicago, etc. But there are proper ways to do attribution in documentation. Remember, I'm a librarian, not a lawyer. With fair use, attribution and documentation are critical, giving credit where credit is due. It's what we hammer into our students' heads when doing research. It's not just about academic integrity compliance. It's also about the provenance of ideas. From a practical point of view, if you are using copyright materials in your courses, which I bet you are, ensure that you have fair use disclaimers clearly attached or associated with any copyrighted material that you are using. Again, more on the disclaimer shortly. The image on this slide is a screen capture from the Syracuse Journal of Science and Technology Law. Attaching a notice like this represents good faith on your part when using copyrighted materials in the context of teaching, learning, and research. If you've ever gotten an article through ILL, this may look familiar to you. I am not going to read the entirety of this disclaimer to you, but I want you to make note of something, and that is that first line under fair use. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, education, and research. Remember that. So, the disclaimer contains a reference to Section 107. Fair use is outlined under Section 107 of the Copyright Act, which is what we've covered so far. Section 107 is what enables educators and researchers to do what they do. Section 107 also covers the use of copyrighted material for criticism, commentary, and news reporting. This is also where coverage for parody and satire lives. And if you are a YouTube junkie like I am, a great many YouTube commentary channels couldn't do what they do without fair use as well. The 4 factors mentioned in the fair use disclaimer on the previous slide are outlined in Section 107. They include the purpose and the character of the work, nature of the copyrighted work, amount and substantiality, and effect on the market. See, I told you that this always had a tendency to go back to the commercial. This presentation is not going to delve into these factors, but there is a link in this presentation to more about those things. There's another section under the Copyright Act that's very important. Section 121, also known as the Chaffee Amendment. This section can be thought of primarily in terms of civil rights. The purpose of Section 121 is to ensure that blind individuals and others with certain physical impairments had access to standard print works. However, it should also be thought of in terms of access to education. It creates a way for educators to ensure that the materials their learners are using are accessible by eliminating the need to obtain permission to transform existing copyrighted works for the purpose of enabling learners to have access. Brandon Butler, Prue Adler, and Krista Cox, writing The Law in Accessible Texts, Reconciling Civil Rights and Copyrights as part of the Federating Repositories of Accessible Materials for Education, a grant-supported project, state that each step of a remediation and sharing workflow is permitted by copyright. Remediation refers to making the text accessible. This can be scanning a print-only text to make it digitally available or generating a Braille version of the text. Those Braille versions were the earliest forms of copyright allowances for accessibility. Sharing workflow refers to how the remediator provides the accessible copy of the requested material available to the requester. This could be emailing the digital copy of the text to the requester or helping arrange for the requester to pick up the Braille version of the text. A highly simplified version of a Section 121 request is as follows. The request is made, the remediation occurs, the remediation is delivered to the requester, and then the entity who created the remediated copy retains a copy and determines how it can be shared. A few explanations are required. The requester can be anyone who has a disability that prevents them from using traditional print or electronic formats. Butler et al. Note that persons with print disabilities, including learning disabilities, as well as visual and physical impairments, are explicitly covered by Section 121 and the Hathi Trust opinion. The request does not necessitate the purchase of an inaccessible copy of the requested text by either the requester or the fulfilling institution. The language of Section 121 does not use the language of purchasing, nor does it require that a copy be bought. In other words, a library could borrow a copy from a lending library and use that copy to create an accessible copy. Remediation can take different shapes. Initially, Section 121 meant converting standard print materials to Braille or other formats friendly for the visually impaired. However, that section has evolved over time to simply read accessible formats to accommodate the various disabilities mentioned on the previous slide. This means remediation can also take the form of closed captions on a video and alt text on images in digital files, such as the images used in this presentation or on social media. Now that we've briefly discussed remediation, because there simply isn't time to cover all the ins and outs of remediation, we must ask ourselves, what else is needed? If your library remediates a non-accessible text for the benefit of a person with a disability covered under Section 121, there are a couple of things you'll need to do once that accessible format is ready. The new accessible copy must bear a notice that any further reproduction or distribution in a format other than an accessible format is infringement, and the new accessible copy must include a copyright notice identifying the copyright owner and date of the original publication. Please note, the Marrakesh Treaty Implementation Act of 2018 allows libraries to import and export accessible format copies without infringing on copyright. We don't have time to dig into that today, but given that we all have international students or users, and at some point, if it hasn't already happened, we will have international students or users with disabilities that may require obtaining accessible formats of needed texts, we need to be aware of it. The Marrakesh Treaty Implementation Act supports such situations. By now, it may be becoming clear why this presentation exists. WCAG 2.1 compliance. Butler et al.'s analysis of Section 121 notes that the fair use analysis of Hathi Trust is premised on the importance of accessibility as an objective and failure of the market to meet it. Emphasis added. As institutions of higher learning or public libraries, we are motivated to make education accessible, where accessible means different things for different people, whether student, educator, or researcher. Even without the coming WCAG 2.1 compliance requirement, institutions of higher learning already had and will continue to have a responsibility to accessibility. Section 121 means that IHLs must remedy the failure in the market. WCAG 2.1 is also a part of that effort. Section 121 helps institutions of higher learning address existing materials. WCAG 2.1 is an attempt to ensure that more materials are born accessible. In essence, WCAG 2.1 puts remediation at the front of the workload rather in the middle like Section 121 does. Do we have any questions? I know that was kind of a quick go through, but it would be very easy to get lost in the ins and outs of, well, what does remediation mean and what does disability mean in this? And I think those are much deeper conversations, but are there any questions?
So far, no one has posted a question in the chat, but we'll give everyone a couple of minutes um, to think of anything. And if not, we can take a short break and then we will return with another presentation by Daniel Perez.
If anybody feels comfortable unmuting and asking, that's also an option.
What she said. We have a question in the chat. They say, 121 seems to need a request. Are we covered to preemptively make something accessible?
Preemptively, no. If you're like, oh man, I would love to take this really popular book that I have in my collection and go ahead and create some kind of accessible version, that's inadvisable. 121 requires a request. If we go ahead and attempt to make accessible versions, we veer into the problem that Google Books had many, many years ago. And they're like, hey, let's just digitally scan everything. That's not going to make anybody mad, right? That's not going to violate any copyright, right? Section 121 says it is meant to be done in response to a request. It is that request that triggers the 121 remediation. Does that answer the question?
Sort of. So we have a rule where we have to make every content that we put into like Canvas accessible. So if a faculty wants to use something and it's copyrighted and what we can link to is not accessible, they can't put it in their course unless they make it accessible, even if they don't have any specific requests to make it accessible.
So this is not a 121 thing. This is actually a WCAG compliance thing. So in that case, they're covered under WCAG.
So are we covered by the same, does WCAG request cover us where 121 doesn't cover us to make it preemptively accessible?
Actually, 107 covers you because it's fair use for instruction, for like teaching and research. Now, I will say this. The reason I made a big deal about the out of print thing was that in my previous institution, I had a faculty member who scanned an entire book that was out of print and dropped it into their Moodle show. That is a copyright infringement. Because remember, fair use covers us for limited portions of a work. So just because it was out of print, they were not covered by fair use to do that, to make it accessible to their class. The compromise there was that I told them that they could scan the essays that they were definitely teaching on in that class and make those available, as long as each one was accompanied by that fair use disclaimer. So in the case of your question, 107 covers, but remember, if it's like an entire work, like a book, you're not going to be able to put the whole book in there. That's a violation.
Right. So if the faculty member is linking to something that is not accessible and it's an entire work, then they can't make it accessible unless they actually have a request to make it accessible, because otherwise they'd be making it, fair use wouldn't cover it because they're using the entire work.
What is the entire work? Because again, if it's a book, it's less, it becomes harder to quantify, like,
right.
Yeah, because we go back to the Google Books thing, they got in a lot of trouble for doing that, you know. Is it if it's a journal article, then creating an accessible copy of that is
no,
complete.
like a journal article is fine. I'm thinking in the cases where they are trying to link to like an ebook, for example, or some type of a larger work where it's quite a bit, or they want to use more than just a tiny bit of a work. So it's, I mean, there's always gray areas. So,
Yes, and I think this is one of those.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem. Again, good faith is your friend. If you're saying, all right, this is required in the class, we have to anticipate making it accessible because of WCAG. So we're gonna take this whole thing and we're gonna hope we're not about to get in trouble for it. We're going to tack on that fair use disclaimer, maybe a reference to section 121. I think we're covering our bases there. And if there was a challenge to that, then there could be some kind of official request initiated within that circumstance. But again, going back to that good faith effort to cover, make sure that fair use disclaimer is there. See, this is what I love / sarcasm about fair use, is that it doesn't exactly address everything. And I know that WCAG compliance does consider the copyright question, because if there's something that's infringement, the law doesn't excuse it just because of that. But I do know that like course materials can be tricky, because if you're making a course accessible under the compliance requirements, then that includes those resources. Where we've had faculty member wanting to use resources that we couldn't make compliant for whatever reason, we've encouraged them to consider alternatives where possible. At least at my institution.
This isn't so much as a question. This is a comment from Catherine Williamson. She states that she went to the IDS conference because one of her main roles is in ILL. There are a lot of really cool things coming from the ILL world in line with accessibility. For example, Crosslink Iris, IRIS, and Emma. This is all coming out of the IDS network. I don't know what Emma is. And I don't really know much about ILL, but this is super informative.
I think I wouldn't be surprised if one of the reasons that WCAG was deferred had to do with these kinds of questions. Like, that wouldn't surprise me in the least. Of course, we'll probably never know, or if we do know, it'll be after the fact. But it's how do we make these things compliant for education if they're demanding compliance and not violate copyright law? We have to have clear guidance on those things, which is why I was stoked to discover about 121, because 121 says, oh no, if you're doing this for accessibility purposes, then you're not really going to have to fight for it. But my understanding of 121 is that you need an initiation. But it's possible, Ingrid, and I'm using Ingrid because I believe that was the person who asked the question. If that is not your preferred name, please let me know. There's a request that is initiated, and it's usually meant to be by the person who needs the accommodation. But wouldn't you think that a professor who wants to be preemptive about it would be the requester? But if they're not needing the accommodation themselves, it becomes tricky for sure. And it's that kind of beautiful gray area that I think makes a lot of this stuff difficult. I mean, they had to come back and add the Marrakesh Treaty to be like, oh, if this is in another language entirely, and we need access to that copy, and it's not common in this country, we have to order it from somewhere else. I am totally not buying this for sketchy copyright reasons. I'm buying this for legitimate reasons.
We have another comment from Brandy in the chat. She said, sorry if this was said, but the lawyer working with Nichols has said that it is okay to print out a copy of an out-of-print book on course reserves. So if a faculty member scanned it and has a PDF, you can print it to make it available at the library on reserves.
See, but that is a controlled environment. It's not just making it available in the course shell, because the question becomes who's regulating it. And that was the problem with it being in the Moodle shell, is that it was in its entirety with no copyright disclaimer. But when we started breaking it up into essays and it was scattered across different aspects of the course, then we had fewer trouble. And if it's on a course reserve, then we're not being sketchy either. It's in a controlled environment with an attached copyright disclaimer.
Yeah, I could have just unmuted. But yeah, that's what trying to get our faculty, they were doing the same thing, putting like all these PDFs in their courses. And so now they're saying this because they're worried about the WCAG compliance. So they're like, well, I have this out of print book in a PDF in my course. How am I going to make that compliant? And then I'm like, why do you have a PDF of a full book in your course? So I'm like, wait, you got two problems here. So I just reached out to campus to find like the lawyer to confirm that it would be okay. So now we're trying to get those faculty who are worried about the WCAG compliance in their PDF, like don't put it, they're now not going to put it in there because of the WCAG. And I'm like, look, if you print it and give it to us, we'll put it on course reserves for you. So it's like there's more faculty now coming out, I guess, unknowingly admitting to it. Not some may not have realized they were doing a copyright law problem. Some may have and just didn't care. They just wanted to get it to their students, but trying to turn this into all right, let's save everyone here. You can't put it in your course. You're worried about breaking WCAG compliance. Got it. You shouldn't have done it anyway. Okay, we understand. Print it, give it to us. We'll put it in course reserve at the library. And now let's talk about an OER for you that you can now do. That's sort of what we're trying to do with that conversation.
Doubling down. I love it. But I think it's important to do that. And the reason that I tend to go through anytime I do a presentation on copyright, that I go through a basic overview of copyright and a basic overview of fair use, is that I found a lot of faculty don't understand fair use. And again, that faculty member, I think she's retired by now, but she was in communications. And you would think in mass communications, you would think that in a discipline where they understand the importance of intellectual property rights and licensing fees, that she would have understood that out of print did not mean out of copyright, but she genuinely thought that those two things were the same. And so it's important for us to advocate to our faculty, those are not the same. And you could be in trouble if you're not documenting this purposefully and intentionally. Which is why I always say it's a good faith effort. And if we're an institution and we're not selling copies of that PDF, we're not making it available on the World Wide Web, it's in a controlled environment. That's a good faith effort that the law tends to acknowledge and says, hey, all right, you're doing your best. If somebody else does something sketchy, that's not on you. If you've ever stayed in a hotel that gave you free Wi-Fi and you've signed in to use it, you've probably had to agree to, I'm not going to do anything sketchy while using your network. I'm not going to pirate things. I'm not going to download illegal things. It's a very similar sort of situation, structurally speaking. I appreciate all these comments because, again, I'm a librarian, not a lawyer. And I was looking through this lens in terms of like copyright, and I think it's valuable to have all these conversations across the board. Any other comments? Any other questions? I appreciate this discussion. It's valuable.
If there aren't any more questions right now, Megan will still be on for the rest of today. Like I said earlier this morning, these presentations will be made available online along with any links that she's mentioned, and her entire script will also be online on our NOLA ILC homepage.
Thank you for attending today, and I hope it's been helpful. And here is my email address, my LinkedIn profile. Please feel free to reach out. Say what?
It's a little cut off.
Well, let's do it like this. Is that more visible?
Sort of.
Strange. Anyway,
It might just be my computer. Yeah, it's just me.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay.
Or you can put that link in the chat.
Yes, you can also
yes.
put that in.
Let me stop sharing. There we go.
All right, we will take a quick 5-minute break and be back at 10:45 a.m. with our next presentation. See you all in a bit. No.
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 Oh, wait. Nope.
I did make you co-host. You should be able to.
Let me see if I just click this button right here. Does that work?
Yes,
So everyone can see my presentation now?
correct.
All right, perfect. Sorry about that. This is my first presentation. All right, so my name is Daniel Perez. I'm the manager of the East Bank Regional Library, a part of the Jefferson Parish Public Library System. And my lightning talk today is going to be on accessibility as community practice, insights gained from our library neurodiversity awareness event. Uh, so the main message that I want to at least promote through this lightning talk was to show how accessibility can be both a goal of service and a work of information literacy. When we talk about information literacy, we often think about databases, research skills, or evaluating information online. But information literacy can also include helping people discover and navigate trusted sources of information within their communities. Through information literacy, we can help our patrons obtain, access, evaluate, and connect information to real life needs, and most importantly, be able to participate more within their communities. This event started about 3 years ago. A colleague of ours wanted to hold a special one-off event during National Autism Awareness Month in April. She was able to get one community partner at the time, which was the Autism Society of Greater New Orleans. She also had gaming tables and sensory activities for patrons to engage with. When she left, I kind of stepped in to try to take over the program. I was then encouraged by one of my mentors to start a community of practice, which was my first involvement with starting something like that. It was getting like-minded individuals and colleagues together to share ideas and experiences and contacts so that we can help improve services for our neurodivergent patrons and to also help expand on this program and event. This is just an example of that. We had members of our outreach and programming teams setting up tables at the neurodiversity event that we held, where they were promoting our library services and registering new library card users. Key thing that I want to emphasize was that collaboration across all of our departments was very important in helping make this event successful. We learned a lot from one another during the process, and it also shows that working towards making things more accessible in our library has become a major part of our organizational culture. The event itself, we called it Celebrating Neurodiversity. We held this year's event on April 24th and held it for about 4 hours. We held it in the East Bank Regional Library's Jefferson and Napoleon rooms. When we open up the partition, the rooms together can probably fit about 150 patrons in all. It was a very informal environment. You know, the atmosphere that we were trying to create was one that was welcoming and interactive and community focused, where we had a lot of our community partners set up around the room, tabling information so patrons can come at them at their own leisure and pace. This event was essentially information literacy in action. It helped to support information literacy by allowing patrons to discover local trusted organizations, to learn about some of their available services and programs that they offer, to be able to ask questions directly to the experts out in the field, to collect informational materials, to explore advocacy, educational, and support opportunities, and most importantly, to build connections beyond the library. In this case, key takeaway was that the library acted as an information and community hub, connecting our patrons with reliable information sources. And here's pictures of some of our community partners that attended this year's event. We had the Autism Society of Greater New Orleans, Families Helping Families, the YMCA, Gigi's Playhouse, and the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Collaboration again was super key in making this event successful and in creating a very impactful and meaningful experience for our patrons. As far as beyond the library, I'm not going to go through all these names. You can kind of see them here. And of course, I'm more than happy to share a lot of these contacts with these groups and organizations after the presentation. But we couldn't have done it without them. I mean, they were great. We sent out 10 invites this year, and all 10 of them showed up to table at the event. And what was really important about this was that we were building up strong relationships with members of the community and developing future partnerships also with others that we don't have much of a partnership or had a partnership in the past. And already we're already seeing a lot of new opportunities for additional programming and outreach with these groups. And as far as collaboration within the library, again, I couldn't have done this without the help of all of our colleagues and various respective departments here in this library. We had support from the outreach and programming teams, children's and teen librarians. I mean, everyone just came together to really, contribute something special to make this an awesome event. And it just shows that accessibility is most successful when it involves all aspects of an organization and its resources. And this is just a picture that I wanted to share of some of those great volunteers that came out and helped us out. We had Jefferson Parish Parks and Recreation held an art instruction table to the left, and then to the right, we had members of our Makerspace team sharing some of their wares that they produced from the 3D print lab. And the patrons really responded to everything, everything that we had to offer in this event. We had sensory activities, craft stations, and of course, the community partner interactions were a major part of this event. We got a lot of great feedback from patrons that attended this year. I don't really have the numbers from the first event that was held a few years back. I know they just had one community partner that showed up, but in our second year, which was last year, that was the first year that I got involved into helping expand it. We had 4 community partners and about 35 in attendance. And this year, we way more than doubled all that with 10 community partners showing up and over 70 patrons attending the event. And here's some pictures of some of the craft and sensory stations that we had. And then, of course, to highlight, we had a special guest this year. We had the Jefferson Powerlifting Group that trains with the Special Olympic athletes. They won medals in regional and national competitions. And it was great to have them there to help expand perception of inclusion and community participation. They were really great. So lessons learned and looking ahead. So the lessons learned from organizing this awesome event and collaborating with so many people was that it shows that accessibility really does require collaboration within the library and beyond. Community partnerships help to expand information access. Lived experiences strengthens learning, and this was done through the demonstrations and interactions that patrons had with the Jefferson powerlifting team. Informal learning environments can really help support information literacy. The informal setting allowed patrons to kind of explore and get information that they were seeking in a non-anxiety, with less expectations type of environment. And communities often know what they need if they're given a platform. And, again, we got tremendous feedback from patrons that were just great comments on ways that we would like to try to expand and improve on this program. So the next step is for sure to try to keep this as an annual event and to try to expand community partnerships and hopefully incorporate planned presentations and seminars in future events. So again, the whole goal of this lightning talk was to show how accessibility as information literacy through this event program that we formed and collaborated on helped to demonstrate that libraries can be trusted information intermediaries in their communities. Inclusive programming can help connect people to information that they can use that's practical. Community partnerships strengthen information ecosystems and also helps to build up more programming and outreach opportunities within the libraries. And accessibility work creates pathways for participation learning and informed decision making. And so this concludes my presentation. I wanted to cite our photographer, resident photographer, a part of our marketing team, Mr. Dave Rodriguez, who provided the photographs for this event. So I'm open up for any questions.
We don't have any questions in the chat yet, Daniel, but you've got a lot of great comments. Love those numbers. That looks like a great event. Nice. Love this program. I like to hear how those numbers went up so quick. That's awesome.
Yeah. So, I feel like the first event that was held a few years back didn't get a whole lot of traction in terms of marketing. Because I honestly, I hate to say that first year when she did it, I had found out of the program the day of. And so, yeah, we saw some people trickling in, and then she couldn't get like certain rooms booked because things were booked up during that time. So I definitely saw that it had a lot of potential and it just needed a little bit more planning. So we definitely planned ahead. And the second year, I guess, I mean, it was beautiful weather. We weren't really competing with much in the community, but again, this is sort of like a niche program. So I was bummed out about the numbers because I would have liked to see more. But of course, everyone told me that, it's kind of hard to try to gain traction with that. But no, the third year we went all out with trying to get better marketing. I'm sorry. We put things on our digital marquee, which we're very fortunate to have here at East Bank Regional. Online newsletters, social media, flyers, posters, and of course, with all the community partners, this time around, what I did was I definitely tried to encourage more cross promotion with them. So they were able to go to some of their events and promote and say, hey, we were going to show up at Jefferson Parish and have an event there. So come over there and check that out, because we offered something different from some of the events that they were participating in. So yeah, I'm definitely looking to try to get those numbers to triple digits next year. So
That's awesome. Got a lot of folks talking about already thinking about how they can use this on campus or translate this to their own campuses for sure. That's great.
yeah, I think this is something relevant to all library settings. Just try to promote inclusiveness and accessibility, and just make people feel welcomed and comfortable coming in. Yeah.
This was great. I love a success story. It's so good to hear about it, especially when it comes to neurodiversity. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm sure Daniel will be hanging around in the chat if anyone wanted to message him. We will go ahead and move on to our final presentation for the day. Let me find Janine. She found herself. That's great. Okay, up next we have Janine Smith from the Loyola University of New Orleans, and her presentation, The City Holds the Memories, Storytelling with Archival Records, and I'm not going to pronounce that name.
All right, well, I will take it away. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me today. My name is Janine Smith. As Iriana said, I am the University Archivist and Special Collections Registrar at Loyola University, New Orleans. First of all, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, the chat has gone away, so I can't see anything now. I will start with a little caveat. I am recovering from a summer cold, and so I'm hoping to not go into a coughing fit or lose my voice, but I'm going to do my best. So yeah, let's jump into it. Today, we're going to be taking a little bit of a left turn from accessibility, and we will be discussing how archival records hold community memory, and in this case, how archives across New Orleans can help with storytelling. And the name of this presentation is The City Holds the Memory, Storytelling with Archival Records and the Life of Thomy Lafon. So one of the important takeaways is to notice the interconnectedness of these archives and how together they can weave a more coherent story. And I aim to make you aware of some of these really great repositories and collections that can be explored and used for research. And I hope it doesn't sound too disjointed as I discuss the life of Thomy Lafon while explaining where these different records are housed and how when they're strung together, they can tell a really fascinating story. Also, I'd like to preference that there may be some gaps in information. This is a project that I've been working on and off for the past 6 years and have been continuing to do some research. And I first learned about this history back in late 2020, early 2021, when I was working as an archivist for the clerk of Civil District Court for Orleans Parish, and was tasked with creating virtual showcases via blogs during the pandemic. And one of the blogs that I wrote focused on women of color as property owners in the 18th and 19th century. And so we are going to talk about Thomy Lafon, and he was an African-American who amassed a great deal of wealth, estimated around $600,000 in property and assets at the time of his death in 1893. But what makes the story unique is that he lived so modestly and gave large sums of money to charity and charitable organizations. And in order to better understand the life of Thomy Lafon, we need to gain a better understanding of how he accumulated wealth by looking at where he came from and who his family was, and the strong women who surrounded him. So Julie Brion is Thomy Lafon's maternal grandmother. She was born into slavery around 1754. And this document reveals that her enslavers were Rene or Renato Brion and Mariana Piquieri. It is speculated that Rene Brion was her biological father, as Julie is identified in this record as una mulata, a racial classification for having one white parent and one black parent, in addition to the use of Brion as her surname, although it was not necessarily uncommon for the enslaved to take on the last name of their enslavers. This particular record is housed in the Orleans Parish Clerk of Court Notarial Archives Research Center, where I was previously working. And this is the record of emancipation for Julie, age 22, and her 3 children, Benedict, age 4, Akil, age 3, and Modeste, age 1. Julie was emancipated on October 12, 1776, for her good service in the presence of Notary Juan Garrigue. So the Notarial Archive Research Center, it houses the records of Orleans Parish notaries dating back to the French colonial period, and the records date back as early as the 1730s. And under civil law, which Louisiana still operates, notaries can draft, prepare, and execute affidavits, acknowledgments, authentic acts, just as an attorney can under common law. And notarial acts are legally binding documents, typically financial in nature, and are usually contractual agreements. Notarial acts are, but not limited to, property sales, mortgages, leases, emancipations, marriage contracts, building contracts, wills, family meetings, inventories of estate, business incorporations, and marine protest. And I did want to briefly mention the collection of plan book plans that they have. I know the name sounds a little redundant. There is a logical explanation for that, but I will save that for another time. But they have over 5,000 of these large-scale 19th century watercolor lot surveys, many of which contain architectural drawings with floor plans, landscape designs, and other cultural details. These plans were designed to hang in auction houses and were meant to attract potential buyers, but they are of historical significance because they can be used to trace the history of a property, including the architectural history of the structures and the typographical changes. And then within the collection, they have several examples of famous New Orleans buildings, including Preservation Hall and the Degas House. And we'll have a relevant example coming up in just a moment. But going back to the family tree for a moment, we see that Julie Brion's lifelong partner was Joseph Fouché. And Julie had 2 children from a previous relationship, Benedict and Akil. And then we come to Modeste Fouché, who is the biological daughter of Julie and Joseph, and this would be the mother of Thomy Lafon. But to keep this part of the family history short and to the point, Julie and Joseph could not legally marry because of Julie's race, but the couple went on to have 4 more children, all of whom took their father's last name. So we know that Joseph was likely wealthy, as records from the State Museum indicate that he was the treasurer of the Superior Council for the City of New Orleans, treasurer of the Spanish Army, and senior court judge, all within a few years of each other. While these records are similar to the colonial records of the Notarial Archives, the early colonial judicial documents are housed at the Louisiana Historical Center, which is part of the Louisiana State Museum. And these images on the previous slide are known as Black Book translations of the original documents, and they were created by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s. So since Julie's relationship to Joseph was not legally recognized, any property that Julie owned was hers alone to manage. Contrary to popular belief, women in Louisiana during this time could own property due to the advantages laid out by civil law and others that common law did not have. Women were able to retain their identity, personal property, and the right to their own money, such as from labor or inheritance. A woman could be entitled to half of the property acquired during marriage while having the option to own and retain separate property. And the law even applied to free women of color and for them to own and administer property. Sorry, voice is starting to trip me up. Furthermore, if a woman was unmarried, she would be solely in control of her property, and we're going to learn a little bit more about Julie's property in just a moment. So enter Modeste Fouché. She was born around 1775, and by the time she was an adult, she began buying and selling properties in the French Quarter. And she is said to be the lifelong partner of Bartholomew Lafon, with whom she had 5 children. And so if you pay attention to the plan book plan, it's going to come up in just a moment, and we'll revisit it. So sadly, Julie passed away at the young age of 49 in 1804, and this is another record from the Notarial Archives. This is the adjudication or the settling of Julie's estate before notary Pierre Petesclos or Pedro Petesclos during the Spanish rule, or even Peter Petesclos during or post-Louisiana Purchase. It gets confusing, but I digress, but his name does come back up in a moment. There's a lot of interconnectedness, as you will see, and that's kind of the point here. In this notarial act, Modeste is identified as a quadroon by offensive standards of the past. This generally meant that the individual had one parent who was biracial and one parent who was white. And in the adjudication, Modeste required a lot of ground with a 2-story house on Charter Street. And if you notice the names in the margin, that's typically where the parties are involved. Parties that are listed that are involved in the Notarial Act are given here. And you can see Archival Burrell's name, Modeste's brother, is listed 2 names above her own. And this house should look familiar from the previous plan book plan. It's in grayscale, and I included it here from the Vieux Carré survey, which is a database of French Quarter properties from the historic New Orleans collection. I've included it here because the clarity is better than the image that I have access to, and you'll see in just a moment. Okay, so here it is in color, and what I love about this is it really is a prime example of how we can use archival material and storytelling. And this house belonged to Modeste up until her death in 1853, but it gives you an idea of what the house looked like at that time. And again, being able to use that in archival storytelling, we can imagine Modeste opening up these vertical wooden shutters in that like kind of traditional New Orleans French Quarter green paint. And, and then there's chimneys. It just really does give us an idea of what the house looked like and how we can use that to better explain what life would have been like for Modeste back then. And this is what the property looks like today. There's a lot of similarities that you can see, including the side gate, but a lot of the facade of the property has had a lot of cosmetic changes. All right, and here's a list of the properties that Modeste owned, including a large portion of the 400 block of Charter Street. So in addition to using the Vieux Carré survey, I perused the general collections of the historic New Orleans collection. I don't know why that name's given me fits today. But it led me to surveys and maps that were produced by Bartholomew Lafon. And the Historic New Orleans Collection, if you're not familiar with it, it is a museum research center and publisher dedicated to the study and preservation of the history and culture of New Orleans and the Gulf South. So for me, this is where the story gets really intriguing and somewhat convoluted. I mentioned that Modeste was said to be the lifelong partner of Bartholomew Lafon. And if you're not familiar with him, he had a really well-known and extensive career in New Orleans as a city surveyor, cartographer, architect, and builder, and he was the responsible person for naming New Orleans streets after the 9 muses in Greek mythology. So he was born in Villepinte near Castelnau, France, in the Languedoc region, and later moved to New Orleans. And through his illustrious career, he amassed a large estate and several properties. And leading up to the Battle of New Orleans, Bartholomew built fortifications and created maps. And it was at this time that he began rubbing elbows with notorious pirates Jean Lafitte and Pierre Lafitte. And apparently his foray into piracy is well documented in the collections at the Galveston and Texas History Center, but I haven't done any extensive research into those archives at this point. And then Lafon died in 1820 after contracting yellow fever. So again, this is where it gets kind of interesting and somewhat convoluted, but initially, researchers dismissed the idea of Thomy Lafon being the son of Bartholomew Lafon because there were no birth records or baptismal records that could be found. But then a new theory emerged, and it was speculated that Lafon fathered 5 children with Modeste, Julie, who died in infancy, Pierre Bartholomew or Pedro Jose Bartolome, the Spanish version of that, and Carmelite Larald, and Thomy and Alfie Lafon. And the theory is that the children were baptized as white with fictitious names or coded identities of the parents. So this record was submitted to the New Orleans probate court in 1830 in order to add legitimacy to Pedro Bartolome's claim as an heir of Bartholomew's estate. And it states that Pedro was baptized in St. Louis Cathedral on March 19, 1808 to parents Pedro Larald and Augustina Josefa Fouché. And this baptism was performed by Father Antonio Sedea, also known as Père Antoine, who recorded it in the Registry of White Baptisms as race was recorded separately. And we know that Modeste often used the name Augustina Josefa as an alias. But then Pedro Larald appears in city records and in the census, but he was several years older, like decades older than Modeste, with no other apparent connections. And it is curious to note that one of the godparents listed is none other than Pedro Pettisclo, who was the notary who helped Modeste settle her mother's estate. And his name appears, let's see, right here. And then in the latest version of Bartholomew's will and testament, he acknowledges his parentage to Pedro and Carmelite. But the unfortunate thing is he updated the will before Thomy Lafon was born. So there was no claim to his parentage there. And if you were like me and thinking code names, secrecy, the approval of the priest was outlandish, I did too, and I wanted further proof. So in my research, there was an obscure citation that kind of struck my interest. The citation claimed that further information on Thomy Lafon's family could be found in an unpublished study that was submitted to the Archive of the Sisters of the Holy Family. So up until now, most of my research had been conducted back in like 2021, as I had mentioned, and I would occasionally pick it up here and there. But now I'm finally in a place where I can dedicate more time to this. And a couple months ago, I reached out to the sisters about this study, and I was invited by Sister Sylvia Thibodeau to visit the archive. All right, one second. Need a water break. So the Sisters of the Holy Family are a Catholic order of African American nuns, the second oldest Black order in the United States. And they were founded by Henriette DeLille in 1837. So Loyola also has a unique relationship with the sisters, as they are technically Loyola's first African-American students, dating back into the 1920s, when they were receiving teaching certification off campus with Loyola as the crediting institution. And it really was such a memorable experience to meet with Sister Sylvia. And the archive is small and modest, and the collection of Thomy Lafon there is also very small. It's exactly one archival document box. And if you're wondering why it's in their archive, that will become very apparent in just a little bit. But in addition to the survey, there were a few pleasant surprises in this collection. So meet Thomy Lafon. There is no date for this when this photograph was taken, but it's evident that he was an older man. And again, this is another good example of how we can use archival records to tell Tommy's story just by the stoic expression on his face, his slender build, and his clothes. The suit looks, upscale and nice, and it's well pieced together. But going back to Tommy's parentage, the study revealed that while no true archival evidence has been discovered directly linking Thomy to as the son of Bartholomew, there's some interesting circumstantial evidence that points to that direction. So the research identified 2 baptismal records located in the Office of Archives and Records of the Archdiocese of New Orleans. 2 children were baptized on August 8th, 1822, 2 years after Bartholomew Lafon's death, under the names of Pedro and Celestina Larald. While it's not going to satisfy all the answers that I have about, or the questions that I have about this, there's some important pieces of information to point out to you. So starting with Pedro's birth date is the exact same as Thomy Lafon's, which is December 28th, 1810. And Alfie's birthday is very similar to, Celestina's birthday is very similar to Alfie's, but it's not quite exact. It's November 17th, 1813. So I'm sure you're probably aware that with census records and other archival records, you'll see some variations of names and dates. But with early record keeping, while it was very important, was not always precise. And so again, you'll see Augustina Josefa Fouché as listed as the mother. And then there are the siblings that are also listed, which have some variations of other siblings listed. And then lastly, I find this probably the most interesting point to these records is this native of Castelnau in Languedoc, which is the birthplace of Bartholomew Lafon, and where he grew up for about 20 years before moving to New Orleans. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to get a copy of the baptismal records from the Archdiocese due to time constraints on my part, but I knew where I could find the published indices to show you what was included on the record, which you see on the screen. So that brings us to Loyola University Special Collections and Archives. And while we don't have any archival records that directly relate to Thomy Lafon, we do have the copies of the Archdiocese of New Orleans Sacramental Record indices and the New Orleans City Directories, which reveal some interesting elements to this story. Sorry, checking on my time. All right, let's see. So here's some examples from the City Directory. In 1822, Modeste is listed as a widow. And I find this curious because we discussed that Modeste's inability to legally marry Bartholomew. And then in 1834, Modeste is noted as selling dry goods, which indicates that she's still continuing in industry. But then I'd also like to point out that the women listed on the right-hand side below Modeste's name are indicated as FWC or Free Women of Color, and Modeste does not have this same identifier. But there is some relation between these women. And I also wanted to point out how important census records were to this process. They provide a lot of information that confirmed occupations and gave descriptions of estate and personal assets that further confirmed that Thomy and Alfie's father was born of foreign birth, and that in 1840, Thomy is listed as the head of household. This is the 1850 that you see on the screen. But in 1840, he was listed as having 9 free people of color and 5 enslaved people living at his residence. There's no names listed, just ages. And I haven't been able to research this further, so I'm not sure under what circumstances. But that's one of the things that I'd like to explore as I continue on with this. But we'll see later that Lafon had a really firm commitment to civil rights and equality. Oh, but to flesh out this 1850 census here and what family life and work look like, Thomy here is also listed as the head of household at age 38, working as a broker with $10,000 in real estate. And we see that Modeste, age 65, is living with her children, Thomy and Alfie, and also Alfie's husband. His name was Levinsky Bowden, and he was born in Cuba, and at this point was currently working as a shoemaker. And this leads us to another happy surprise in the Archive of the Sisters of the Holy Family. This is Alfie Bowden. And she and Thomy must have been very close. She and her husband lived with Thomy until Levinsky's death in 1884. and Alvy continued living with Thomy until his death in 1893. But let's shift to Tommy's industry to get a loose idea of how he amassed his wealth. We'll see how in 1841, Thomy had the modest job of bricklayer. From the 1850 century, we know he was already working as a broker with $10,000 in real estate. And then between 1861 and 1874, Thomy worked at various offices on Exchange Place. And if you're not familiar with Exchange Place, it was a prominent street to conduct business. And as historian Richard Campanella writes, it was a multi-use, multi-service shared space with meeting rooms, auction rooms, and trading floors, providing offices for various agencies and enterprise. And it's really telling of the echelon of business that Thomy was conducting. But what stands out to me is the lack of school teacher as an occupation, and then this mention of lawyer in 1874. In my research and literature review, there's been no mention of lawyer as a profession, and then there have been no substantiated archival records to support that Thomy was a school teacher. So in future research endeavors, I'd like to explore those claims further. But you will notice the consistency of 272 Ursulines as his residence, and then the inconsistency in the spelling of Tommy's name, both for, and it looks like in the last name is spelled correctly, but all the variations of Thomy, which points back to the fact that early archival records are not always consistent in spelling. So I was already familiar with 242 Ursulines and have seen Google map images, but this was another exciting discovery in the archive of the Sisters of Holy Family. Excuse me, I'm gonna have to put a cough drop in. So let's turn to Lafon's legacy. Further pointing to Tommy's accumulated wealth is evidenced by the tomb that was constructed for his final resting place in St. Louis Cemetery No. 3. While the tomb itself is modest and not elaborately decorated, any tomb of this size would have been of some substantial expense. Sorry, give me just a second. I knew this was going to happen, getting towards the end here, starting to lose it. And then to further prove his closeness with his family, you can see that Tommy's mother, Modeste, is buried directly in front of his tomb. And I wish I had a chance to locate Lafon's inventory of estate, because it would really give us an idea of just how modestly but comfortably he lived. There's a several-page document, it's like 27 pages long, that documents all of the contents in his house and his assets. And it's all just very basic, modest items. So one article in the Times-Picayune states that a leader of charity passed away. The article attempts to describe Lafon and give some insight into the kind of person he was. I'm going to paraphrase it a bit here, but the article essentially says he was well known to very many. Not alone on account of his vast possessions, however, was he popular for he was extremely charitable to all. While he erected and bestowed charitable institutions, he was extremely adverse to notoriety of any kind. His preference for a quiet, peaceful life made it difficult to gather information regarding his career. His style of conversation in English, French, and Spanish evidenced an excellent education. He was careful and shrewd in business and real estate. He never married, and his sister, possessed of the same traits and characteristics, was his chief advisor. He was extremely courteous to everyone and maintained a gentlemanly bearing and dignity in all his transactions. He was one who would attract attention as he moved through a thoroughfare, always clad in a dark, neat, but not expensive suit with well-polished shoes and a silk hat. The article goes on to say that Thomy was dedicated to art and especially fond of music, and attended a concert by Edmond Dede, an African-American violin virtuoso, the week before his death. And between suffering a fall and fighting a cold and some other maladies, Thomy Lafon died in his home at the age of 82 on December 22nd, 1893. And during his lifetime and after his death, he distributed wealth to many. In addition to the property that he shared with Alfie, he had a few others that he bequeathed to her in addition to $10,000. And I had checked an inflation calculator, so I'm not super sure how accurate it is, but it suggested that in 1893, $10,000 would have been about $370,000 in today's money. In this will, he went on to name several family members and friends and bequeathed sums between $500 and $10,000 to those he named. Let's see. Okay. All right. So for time's sake, here's a shortened list of the charities and institutions that Lafon donated to, including Charity Hospital, Shakespeare's Almshouse, and all of these institutions that are in some way relating to caring for the elderly and the orphaned. And there's some anti-slavery societies as well. But perhaps one of the most significant beneficiaries were the Sisters of the Holy Family. There are several documents that record what an impact he made in their endeavors to serve the orphaned and the elderly. And according to a memoir written by one of the sisters, this is one of the main entries that speak to his generosity. So not only did he donate at least $10,000 in several properties, he established a perpetual trust. And many of these properties were to support the Lafon Old Folks Home and the Lafon Boys Orphan Asylum, which the sisters ran and operated. I wanted to quickly circle back to Lafon's civil rights involvement. He was deeply supportive of integration in groups like the Citizens Committee. And if you're not familiar, the Citizens Committee were strong supporters and advocates of Homer Plessy before the Plessy versus Ferguson legislation. And because of his philanthropy and generosity, the Louisiana legislature, just like in a year or two after he passed, commissioned a bust to be erected in his honor. But of course, there was political and racial backlash as to where the bust would be displayed. But happily today, it is on permanent display in the Cabildo. So by 1924, there were numerous institutions across the city named for Lafon. Sadly, many of them no longer exist. But in the case of the Lafon Old Folks Home, it became Odyssey House here in New Orleans, and it's a nonprofit behavioral care provider that specializes in addiction treatment. And to wrap this up, to further tell this story, I'd like to research the properties that bore Lafon's name and what became of them, including there was at least 3 schools named after Lafon, one of which was burned down in a race riot in 1900. And then I know I'm not really like the first person to speak about Thomy Lafon, but he's still fairly not well known in New Orleans history, and I feel that it's time for that to change. So with the help of archival records from across New Orleans, hopefully we can all share in uplifting the life and generosity of Thomy Lafon. And that concludes my presentation, and I made it through somehow.
No questions, but a lot of positive feedback. It's so cool. It's very interesting. Jennifer Lloyd notes that the Charity Hospital report listed Thomy's donation as $25,600.
And that probably was after the settling of his estate. The image on the screen was like, or pulling from that particular record, was a will that was used in the settling of his estate. So it's possible that more money went after the fact.
This is Jennifer. Evidently, there was a plaque for a long time, and it might have been in the 1833 charity that was torn down in 1937. There was a big plaque with a lot of early donors listed. And so in the earlier charity hospital reports, like from the 1920s, they have that on like the front page. And Tulane Medical Library digitized all of those, and they're on archive.org for your entertainment.
Yes, thank you so much.
And then I put the link. We actually inherited a portrait of Thomy Lafon that I got back from the restorationist this month, and it's
that's
being
awesome.
reframed. And yeah, it's really cool. It's an interesting story because it was painted in 1950, and this Italian painter who was sponsored by the Italian consul, came over and painted, you know, this is the height of Jim Crow, painted a bunch of prominent Black people in New Orleans. So that's kind of interesting too.
Yeah, that's really cool. And that's one piece of information that I was not aware of. So you gotta love how these things all come together. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Yes, me too.
All right, we'll give it about 4 more minutes for anybody to get any last comments, questions in. I lied, 3 more minutes. Sitting here in silence for 3 minutes is awful. So since we don't have any takers, I will go ahead and wrap up today's session. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to all of our presenters for today. Their recording will be up hopefully later this evening. If not, everything, like I said earlier this morning, will be up by Friday, July 31st. We will see you all tomorrow. Thank you once again. Enjoy the rest of your day.